Welcome to the Unlocked podcast, hosted by me, Julia Myron.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Unlocked podcast. I am your host, Julia Myron, and I am so happy that you guys chose to tune in today. And this is a podcast where experts lead important conversations in a transparent manner. And today I'm very stoked and excited because we have one such expert, Joanna Cabello. She is a senior researcher on climate change at SOMO. And today, that's what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about all things climate change and answering some of your pertinent questions. So do me a favor and like, share, and subscribe to this channel so you can find out more about when amazing experts come on. So, hi, Joanna. How are you this morning?
Hello, Julia. Yes, I'm fine. I'm enjoying the sun that finally came out. So,
Yes.
quite energetic.
And she's tuning in all the way from Netherlands, right?
Right. Yes.
And I love our podcast because it's a virtual podcast. And I think I'm going to keep it this way so we can have people from all over the world. And that is just so exciting. Okay. So let's begin. If you can tell me more about your work and what you're doing currently, what does it entail? Introduce yourself.
Sure. So, I am originally Peru. I come from Peru. And when, of course, by being born and raised there, and it's a country that has a big chunk of its territory with the Amazon. And I had the privilege to spend some time there and learn so much from many communities that I got in touch with after my university. I was just kind of traveling, but in a more insightful way, like trying to really understand many of the injustices that I could see, but not quite understand why they were happening.
Hmm.
While I was there, I started to hear about this kind of offsetting and some projects talking about like carbon NGOs that were there in the capital talking about carbon, and I didn't understood anything of that, and I didn't think that nobody there could explain to me what that meant at that time. I'm talking about the 2001 early stage of this whole carbon market. So it was very early on, and I just put myself into the task of really understanding what is this about, why is it coming in a way that people can barely understand what it means, but it's already in the agendas of some of the NGOs there, and reaching out to communities, but without a clear information of what it is. So yeah, even in Lima, I had very much difficulties to get into it and yeah, get information about it. And I got a scholarship to have a master degree in the Netherlands, and that's how I came to the Netherlands. I studied in the Institute of Social Studies in The Hague, and there my master thesis was on carbon offsetting and carbon markets. So I dig very much into what is this, where is it coming from, what are the interests, why are we talking about carbon in that sense. And then I became very passionate about, because I really uncovered a lot of the assumptions that were behind this market scheme, and how their narrative was being, or it started to dominate, let's say like this, not just the policy spaces, but even everyday lives, situations, especially in urban settings. So I became very passionate on becoming an activist for climate justice, and my focus was on trying to expose what is behind carbon markets and how they work and the impacts of these.
So you actually have a personal experience with carbon and the effects of carbon marketing and corporate because of where you come from, because Peru is also a place where the Amazon is there, is a place that's very environmentally sensitive. So that it seems that affected how you approach your work, which is very exciting for me because I love to talk to somebody who has personal experience with what they're doing and personal knowledge, as well as the academic experience and expertise to back it up. So I'm very glad that you were able to say that. Um, I saw on your LinkedIn that you say that you are a climate justice activist. So, what is the difference? Is there a difference between climate change activists and a climate justice activist?
Oh, there's a huge difference. I would argue. I think, climate change has just become this big issue because it is a big problem. It's a crisis that is happening now, especially in certain places and especially to specific communities in the world. But we can analyze, or we can see, or we can talk about climate change in very different ways. We can talk about these sort of, climatic events, like we see the floods, and we see the temperature levels, and we can, talk about how much greenhouse gases there are and targets that countries have to pass, and in a very kind of distance way, in a way. So, something to be studied. That's climate
Mm-hmm.
change situation that you can study and analyze and explain outside of yourself. And then there is the climate justice, which puts the power question back into the conversation. So when you talk about climate justice, at least for myself, is when you overlap the layers of why is this crisis happening?
Mm-hmm.
Who embedded, or who has been driving, which actors have been driving this crisis, who is at the other end of this crisis, who are suffering the most of the impacts, and who is bearing the cost of the so-called transition or the so-called solution. So how do we analyze or understand or talk about this crisis, which in a way that is political again, in a way that we put the power question at the center. And by doing that, then we talk about communities, and we talk about those places where most of the times are not only the first ones that are feeling the impacts of the climate change and have the least resources to adapt to these impacts, but also the ones that are being, targeted for the so-called solutions. So they are bearing the cost of what the world is trying to dominate or to push as solutions, but also as the impacts of the crisis. And that is a massive injustice, right? So
Mm-hmm.
where the justice part comes in.
Okay. Now that helps me understand and leads me to my next question. Because when I have conversations with people about climate change, climate, what's going on in the environment, what I hear people say the most is, I'm not the one causing this, right? For example, I'm Nigerian, and Nigerians, if you know Nigerians, we're notorious for, you know, just managing and conservative. We're not very, our electricity, we don't even use a lot of electricity. We're not a place with high industry. So when I have conversations with people about climate change, they're like, I'm not the one causing it, even on an individual level. Like, I'm not the one riding private jets. I barely, I barely drive. Like, but somehow I am told that I'm the one who has to come up with the solution. So it just seems that from that perspective. So I'll give you an example. I was on a social media platform the other day, and somebody took a flight to London, and everybody in the comments were like, "You're causing climate harm." So when I hear those kind of conversations, I think it frustrates people because then they're like, well, just seems like I don't even want to be a part of this conversation if I'm not the one causing the problems. But then whenever you talk about solutions, you're um putting the burden on the individual, the communities who are even being affected by climate change, and not the people in power. So I guess my question to you is, based on your work, who are the people in power? Who are the people causing the most harm for the climate and the environment?
Thanks for that question, Julian. It's extremely important that we name, that we name these drivers, and whether we scream these drivers once and again, and we don't forget that these are the actors that we need to change. Those are the ones that we need to transform or to target for actually doing some sort of climate justice policy. So there are many levels to this question. We have a historical perspective, and we cannot take history out of our analysis. So when we see how colonialism has influenced the way the global north uses resources and extracts from the global south, that already gives us some hints to where, the historical responsibility of the situation that we're living now is placed. So we cannot leave that. That was even recognized in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there are historical responsibilities of the global north, not just due because of the Industrial Revolution. In my perspective, it happens because we have to go back to how the colonial era, or the colonial period, which remains somehow, affected the way how the countries access resources, uses resources, and produces and yeah, consumes these resources, right? So that's one aspect of it. But of course, not everybody in the global north uses the same way the resources, like every citizen. So there are specific actors within these big regions that are more responsible of this crisis. So the main ones, for sure, are the fossil fuel corporations. So fossil fuel, the industry in itself, it's the driver of the climate crisis, and that is just scientifically proven because we are taking out the carbon that has been stored underground for millennia, for hundreds of years, and would remain there unless there comes a company and extracts it with machinery, with heavy machinery, and takes it out to the atmosphere so that the fossil fuel can be refined and consumed and produced. And that is what is happening with the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So for example, the idea of deforestation is a massive problem. Yes, it is a massive problem, but it's not the cause of climate change, in that the carbon in trees, the carbon in the forest, the carbon in soils, this is part of this rotative carbon that goes again between oceans, soils, and the atmosphere itself. So there can be a debalance there, but it is a carbon that is above ground anyways. We can't that amounts. But when we take massive amounts of carbon from the underground, we're just pulling out massive amounts that are not handleable by the earth. The earth cannot deal with so many carbon, and we just keep on pulling out more and more carbon. So fossil fuels have to stop. There is no other way to look at in a serious way on climate change if we don't address the situation that fossil fuel has to stop. But that doesn't mean just like the big ones, Shell, Total, Eni, Repsol, all these big brands or companies that are massive, and they are obviously the ones that need to stop destruction. But there is a whole network of industries that depend on these fossil fuel companies that demand the massive amount of fossil fuels. So it is not the people in their houses needing to heat their houses or cook their meals that are driving the massive demand for energy. It is actually the agribusinesses that are having massive amount of monoculture plantations, especially in the south, using massive amount of fertilizers and deforesting massive amounts of areas. It is also like the aviation industry that needs to have massive amounts of fuel and is subsidized by the state so that this fuel is very low. It is also the car industry, that is an industry in itself. So it is not the problem that me as a citizen drive my car or go on a flight. The problem is that the society is constructed in a way that has become dependent on the fossil fuels. So the changes have to be really structural and radical if we really think about solving this crisis. So these actors, these corporate actors, which have CEOs, which have shareholders, which have people that are mostly these elites that are traveling on jet sets and have these yachts and live on these villas. These are the people that are running, these corporations. It's not corporations in the vacuum. There's people there that are actually profiting massively from this crisis and from keeping the crisis.
I've never had anybody explain climate change to me and the drivers as you have. And that is so important for me to even understand. Like, this is the first time, and I'm being serious, it has clicked for me just how much, you know, you broke it down so well. And I know that anyone who's listening can understand how much a lot of things in our society, we did not get to create the society. We just woke up, we were born, and the systems were already put in place, and we just kind of went along with it. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you have, you're not, and because it's so hard to get access to relevant, transparent, honest information now, the information that we have are just skewed and in a way that we cannot even understand it. So we're just like, okay, I don't care. But now you breaking it down and saying like, there, you have to, these companies are going in the ground and bringing things up that should not be up. This just, even me saying, I'm like, wow, this makes so much sense. And now when I'm having those conversations, I can really explain the impacts and what these corporations and what our society is doing to the planet. And in the beginning, you spoke about the issues and how it affects communities. And being you're from a community that's environmentally sensitive, Peru, what are the impacts you see on climate change, on how we treat our environment, on these drivers impacting the environment on a community level?
Yes, thank you, Julia. I mean, there are two sides to answer this question, in my view. One side of it, and maybe I could start by saying like how I see the dominant narrative of the climate crisis and the climate
Yes, please.
international policy at the moment. Um, Me and many colleagues on the climate justice movement, we call it like a double land grab, a double, impact on communities on the ground. Why is that? Because on the one hand, you have the massive impacts that are being done by the industries that are driving the crisis. So the extraction sites themselves of oil and gas or coal, but also other types of minerals, the mining industry, the agribusinesses industry in this monoculture sense, which needs fertilizing, that is also having a lot of impacts on the health of communities. And these are real life impacts. And there we need to also unpack a little bit, because I feel that we always need to name, the colonial uh, yeah, history of how this is impacted mostly in the global south. And by looking at that lens, we can also see how most of the places in the global south that are having this impact are racialized communities. So are communities that are either indigenous communities or peasant communities, or African communities, Black communities, sorry, or what we call it Afro-American communities. That's what I wanted to
Mhm.
say in the context of Latin American. So it is, disproportionate in many layers. So first you have the global south, then you have the who in the global south. Not everybody in the global south is impacted the same way. It's also
Mm.
these communities that are attached to their land, to attach to their survival agriculture or their own ways of having a communal economy. Those are the communities that are mostly impacted by when these industries come and they pollute massive amounts of land. And it can be either by, evicting the people because they need that land for their businesses, whatever that is, or it can be by indirect pollution. So, polluting the waters they use, polluting the soils that they need, polluting the earth that they breathe, or polluting the crops that they are growing, like with the fertilizers and the pesticides that are passing through the water and passing through the soil to the adjacent communities. So there are so many levels of impact. And of course, we have also the whole issue of having big industries coming into new territories and also having imposing extreme violence on these communities. So there are many studies that show how women and girls are massively disproportionately affected by these industries. And, not only because they are the ones that, of course, are caring most for their families and the health and the agriculture itself. So they need to try whatever they can to hold that, to sustain that nurturing in the traditional communities, but also because their bodies are at risk. I mean, a lot of workers, and usually it's men, come and enter these territories, and then women are always are usually and unfortunately very frequently target of harassment and even rape in some cases. So the impacts are too many to say but they are documented. It's not that I'm saying something that is not out there. There are extremely amounts of reports from academy to NGOs to civil society to declarations from communities themselves to movements that are putting out there like this has to stop. But and these are the ones that are driving climate change. So that is that. And now what we are doing, the international climate policy space, is that we are having so-called solutions or imposing so-called solutions that are targeting those same communities. So indigenous people or small farmers communities or fisher communities that, that they, for doing these so-called carbon offset projects that we can talk later about. But by targeting these communities for doing that, then, we have two aspects. The companies can continue to do their extraction because they claim that there is some project somewhere else that is offsetting that pollution. And by doing that, but these two sides are actual land. They are material, they are real, they are people. So that's how we call it a double land grab, a double impact.
Okay. You can talk about the offsetting because that's interesting to me. I've not heard that before. So if you just want to explain what that means, dive
Yes.
into more.
Yes. So offsetting is part of carbon markets, and it's something that was proposed under the Kyoto Protocol when the governments got together to talk about climate change and what to do about it. It was heavily pushed by the US, but then really much embraced by the EU and countries from the global north mainly. What it means is that it's important to say that it was pushed because I think that governments and the companies behind these governments were realizing, oh no, we don't want environmental regulation. We don't want any climate regulation that can affect our business. And of course, when we talk about fossil fuels being the main driver, any regulation would impact directly their business because, all these industries are dependent on the use of cheap access to fossil fuel. So there was a massive interest in doing corporate friendly policies that could help in between, inverted comillas, help companies to go through this transition to deal with climate change in a way that would not affect their businesses. In my view, that's totally impossible. It's antagonistic in terms, right? But that's what came carbon markets, and offsets is a part of it. So what you do is you just take the whole climate problem and you just turn it, or you just view it from the lens of carbon dioxide molecules. So the problem is an excess of carbon dioxide molecules. So if you view the problem like this, the solution is we are going to count how many carbon molecules there are, and we need to just manage them. So how, a maximum of carbon molecules, we make a limit, and within this limit, we can, manage how these molecules go and where they can stay and where they cannot stay. But to do this, and to do it in a way that is friendly to capitalism, they created what is called a carbon credit, a carbon permit, depending on the scheme. And that means that every carbon permit is 1 ton of CO2, of carbon dioxide. And then companies could trade these permits. So if a company finds it very cheap to reduce their emissions, they would have excess permits that they could sell to other companies that would find it more costly or difficult to reduce their emissions. All sounds okay there. But then comes carbon offsets. Okay, we could problematize that, sure. But Then comes carbon offsets, and carbon offsets are projects established somewhere else, mostly in the global south, which are claiming to reduce emissions or to avoid emissions. And therefore, they generate these carbon credits. And these projects sell these carbon credits to the polluter that needs excess carbon credits. So there's no more limit anymore because you can put endless carbon offset projects in the
Yeah.
south, and create more carbon credits so you can just buy your way out of responsibility. And of course,
Yeah.
projects in the south, then it's very cheap to do the projects. You are avoiding, what we know by history, the regulations of workers,
Yeah.
environmental regulations, etc.
That is again, you're just really blowing my mind right now because it seems to me that you're saying the solution for the problem caused by capitalism is more capitalism. It's
Yes,
just,
absolutely.
that is, that
Exactly
is, that
exactly
is really crazy to me. And it really, oh my goodness. I, I'm really getting enlightened again. That's why I love to talk to experts because I did not know that this is what it, because I hear about even big corporations like Shell, they have a lot of projects going on. I don't know if you know, but in Nigeria, in Delta State in Nigeria, Shell was in big trouble for the things they did in the community. And the community was a very rural, poor community. They rely so heavily on nature, on rivers, and they get water from there. And unknowing to them, the government allowed Shell to create massive issues in the community by dumping oils in the river, and these people were drinking the water unbeknownst to them. So you really see the just the impact and the horribleness of the things going on based on the actions of some corporations. And it brings me to the stakeholders because governments are supposed to be the ones to protect us. But as we see in the Nigeria case study, we see that the government did not appropriately protect us. And then you see with the United States, the political system of the United States is such that, and a lot of Western countries is such that lobbyists, especially corporations, have a
yeah.
huge pull in politics. So even you explaining the carbon offsetting and these corporations trying to avoid environmental regulations and how they just created this illusion. So if we don't know how to do math or we're not very astute, we cannot follow it. So they just bring out reports and we fall for it and say, oh, this is what we're doing. But then you breaking it down like that, we see actually it's not as clear as they're trying to paint it out to be. How do we push for these governments to be responsible and protect our environment and protect us, seeing the harm that their actions are causing?
Yes, Julia, that's an important question. But let me go back a little bit for what you were saying, because
Yes.
in the case of Nigeria and Shell, it's like, ridiculous to think that Shell was promoting itself as a carbon neutral company.
Mm,
It now lost a court case in the Netherlands, so Shell cannot say that they sell carbon neutral fuel. But for years, they were using that slogan. And that is because all the pollution that the company was doing, imagine the amount of pollution that you were just talking about, so was being compensated by projects, one project in Peru, project in Indonesia, and there's big projects that are creating serious impacts. Some of these offset projects have evicted communities from their land. Some
mm,
other offset projects are making communities to sign contracts so that they are contractually obliged to not use their territory in the way that they used to use it. So they lose access, control, autonomy over their territory because the carbon stored in their forest is not theirs anymore. It means
mhm,
the market to Shell or other polluters that want to claim that their business is neutral, is net zero. That net in the narrative of the net zero economy means that you can be compensated. That is not actually zero. Net zero is not zero. Is I'm compensating all my emissions. that I cannot reduce. So therefore, obviously fossil fuels and the big companies are going to offset most of their emissions. So it's ridiculous to me, in common sense, to think that policy is actually allowing, so governments are actually allowing that, the problem will solve the problem, what you were saying.
Mm.
So, and the narrative of carbon markets is so interesting because they take out away any possibility to talk about power and
Mm.
even fossil fuels, because we are talking about carbon dioxide molecules. And they strip away the power question, the historical question. They strip away the racism. They strip away the patriarchy. They strip away all important discussions that we need to have to talk about a market that will solve how much and how many and where molecules should go. When in reality, that is not true. And we know, and there have been many scandals out there in the last 2 years, with media and academy and NGOs, that talk about how these offset projects have failed. I
Mm.
mean, 20 years of experience. So we can say now very clearly that offsets do not work, not just on the technological aspects, so not just because you can never
Mm.
account the amount of CO2 to make it equivalent to fossil fuels that should be underground by some trees,
Yeah.
what we were talking before, and many other problems, but also because it is creating impacts. It is creating massive impacts. It is making communities that maybe we should hear more and learn from. Is taking away their power. Is telling now you are going to do your life like this, and you're not allowed to do what you used to do. So it's a very colonial mechanism. It's a very imposing mechanism. Corporations have been behind the policy debates since the beginning in the climate aspect. We see it in the UN. We see it when they have these intergovernmental negotiations. The biggest industry lobbies are there. So they know that this could affect the core of capitalism. Fossil fuels is the motor that runs this machine. So if we
Mm.
name it, they are very scared about it. What is it going to happen? How is it, going to affect my business? So they rather co-opt the narrative, and they have done it brilliantly in terms of what you were
Yeah.
saying. Go to a flight to London or to wherever, and you have the option as a citizen to offset your flight. You pay
Mm.
more or $1 more over there, and then in theory, you're offsetting your flight. How can that be? A flight
Mm.
4 hours or whatever hours it would be that is emitting fossil carbon to the atmosphere. It's supposed to be compensated by some forest that has to be standing for at least 100 years somewhere else. So if there is
That's
a,
crazy.
it's crazy. I mean, we could unpack it in from different aspects.
Yeah.
But for me, the most important thing is that the starting point is extremely colonial. It's extremely thinking like, the knowledge framework that I'm going to use to understand this problem is Western, is modern, is, like we can detach ourselves from nature, we can manage it. It's about molecules, we categorize it, and we can trade with it and make money, by the way.
Mm. Seriously, I'm gonna keep saying it. You're really making me think about this issue from a whole nother perspective because I did not know about net zero. I thought net zero meant they're clean energy. You might as well have told me that net zero meant they're green. And I would have
Yeah.
believed you. I'd be like, oh wow, I did not know that. So now what is green energy?
Yeah, that's a big question. So of course, the important thing, and I'm not saying that it's important that we don't, grab a plane every time we can, because of course everything counts. Yes, we're in a
Hmm.
contest, so we all have to put our bit. But again, it's the systemic thing what needs to change, right?
Yeah.
Systems, not to the individual things, even though it's good that you turn your light off when you go away, of course. But I need to say this because if not, I always get people saying, like, but we all need to do something. Yes, sure. But we talk about politics as well. We need to
Mm-hmm.
name systemic
Yeah.
problems. And that for me is making a space for the many alternatives that are out there, right? So it's not that the world doesn't know what to do. we know, but it's just that the systemic, how the society and the capital economy has permeated so many aspects of our lives that we make it impossible. So, in that sense, for example, renewable energy is definitely a good trend to go. But what we're seeing now is that the renewable energy is being used to keep up, to keep the machine in the same way of energy consumption and energy. So we are not reducing our consumption. So then we're not solving any problem because we're adding to the fossil energy some renewable energy. That's great, but we need to ask again, who is using that energy? Where is it being produced? And for what? Because it is good that there is like, thousands of hectares of windmills in some community in Mexico that is going to be used for the mining industry, that is going to source some minerals for wherever. That is not the solution we want. So that it's not about changing, some sources of energy to other sources of energy. Yeah, that's part of the conversation. But the biggest, most challenging part is which who is going to use that energy? For what do we need energy? How can we really structurally, systemically reduce the consumption and the use and the production, the demand of the energy system? If we don't go there, there's no more, no matter how much renewable energy we add to the grid is still increasing the demand. So we will need and more and more. And by we, I mean the system. So
The system.
people consuming more, although the global north needs to consume less, that's clear, but it's mainly the system, the industries, the companies. We have to have these conversations.
I want to go back to what you said earlier as well about corrupting the narrative. And no place, I mean, I've been to the United Nations, I've sat down at UN meetings. I mean, there are huge climate change meetings every year that takes place. They just had one last year in, I think, Dubai. Why have we never heard of this? What you're saying, who is driving the conversation that even at the United Nations level, at international levels, we're still not hearing the truth?
I mean, the we're trying to be loud.
Mm.
I mean, there are many organizations that are trying to uncover this narrative, and it's
Mhm.
especially being fed by communities from the global south and indigenous communities also from the north, like in Canada and in the US, that are very active in trying to, you know, unpack what is meant by net zero, by carbon markets. But of course, it's super marginal because the UN, I mean, there is a great campaign that is called Kick the Big Polluters Out, and you can Google it and see. And they made an amazing research on how many fossil fuel groups and companies and fossil fuel people disguised as NGOs, as civil society organizations,
Mm.
inside the negotiation. It was an astronomical amount, bigger, way bigger than many of the governmental groups and negotiators, especially from the global south. So, how can the narrative be different if the space, if the table of negotiation is being co opted for a big, big part by the corporations that don't want to lose out from this regulation? So, it's kind of like, asking the companies to make to push themselves out of their business. That's not going to happen. So if they are sitting down in the negotiation tables, we don't have a chance. And the problem is that many of the governments from the global north, especially, but also from the global south, are aligned or have as an ally some of these corporations because of their economies being dependent on that, or because, investment promises or whatever the reason might be. But this alliance between governments and corporations and how companies are
Mm.
allowed in these spaces is extremely problematic. One of the problems of how these policies can be easily widespread, and the World Bank, of course, being one of the big arms of the U.S. in the world, has been for the last 10 years going around with a so-called readiness program, which is changing, among others, changing legislations of southern countries in order to be able to incorporate carbon in their land tenure system, in their forest legislations. So it's a sort of a structural adjustment program, right? In a way, but in the framework of climate change, in the framework of land and forest. So if there is all this apparatus, it's very difficult to break that narrative. Then the narrative has been is a massive PR, you know,
Mm,
campaign. They even called it nature-based solutions because offsets were starting to have a bit of a critique out there and scandalous. And there is the RED plus, REDD plus, which is forest-based offsets. They also started to get a lot of attention in terms of the critiques, so they changed the name, and they called it nature-based solutions. And then a whole campaign came around, and then the thing could move on. And when there is a critique, the capacity to renew themselves, they have the means, they have the money, they have the political power, and they have also they know that the economy is dependent on the system.
mhm,
So, well, something that would break away the system could be, oh, let's just stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Let's just try to subsidize something else. That would be radically, changing the rules of the game. But we have not reached there because we need to take these corporations away from the negotiation tables as a first step, and hearing more the social movements. I mean, they have been standing on the front lines since the beginning.
mhm. Absolutely. I don't even know, but I'm working on a company that does public-private sector partnerships. And what you said just put the fear in me because I'm like, I do not want to partner with a corporation and they use my firm is a transitional justice firm, so and being a middle ground between helping corporations make impacts, systemic and sustainable impacts in around the world regarding justice and peace. But I don't want my company to be a vehicle for these organizations to put me as a front for their illegal and harmful, dangerous acts. So, what advice, this is just for me now, what advice would you give me in being aware of when a corporation is not truly for social justice? What advice would you give me concerning public private sector partnerships? And is there a way to do it well? And what should I be on the lookout for based on your expertise?
That's a very big question.
I know.
To say something on it. I mean, there are many levels there because I think something that people should look out when engaging in with corporations in terms of the transition or sustainability debates. It's about this indeed, these commitments to net zero, these targets. What are they based on? Are they based on offsets? Well, if they are based on offsets, we know now that very likely they are tied to some problems at the other end where the offset project is established. So maybe look into that or start a conversation with a company that this is not the way to go. There is a lot of bad press starting to happening for companies that also engage in with offsets. So it's also a way of alerting them that this is not the way that consumers that are conscious about what needs to happen want to see. So if we talk about transition or climate or these kind of things, we want to see real action. We want to see real reduction in the emissions. We want to see structural changes. We don't want to see just discourses and buy offset credits. That's easy, and climate is not an easy problem.
Yeah.
So there have to be hard conversations in the public-private partnership. It really depends on the case-to-case business, the case-to-case, because it is about the contract, a specific contract. But
Yeah.
you have to take care that they don't put most of the risks on the public part, so
Mm,
that gets away very easily in case
yeah.
of
Yeah.
right.
Thank you so much. That is so useful. So I wanted to talk to you as well about, we've spoken about the fossil fuel industry. What about the textile industry and the way we fast fashion? What have you seen? Have you noticed any, or what is the gravity of their impact on the environment?
And which industry? Sorry, I didn't hear about.
The textile fashion, fast
Oh,
fashion.
yeah.
Yeah. Like organizations that bring clothes
Yes,
fast.
yes. Sorry, I didn't.
It's okay.
Well, yes, of course. I mean, we can go back to like production of cotton, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
thinking now because it's usually it's, for me it serves very well to unpack an industry, right? And you
Hmm.
with where the materials are being produced that they need for making whatever product they are making, in this case, clothes, right? So there is a massive, I mean, the way that the fashion industry is built, it's about consumption, fast consumption, throw it away, buy another one because it's cheap, and it's cheap because it's based on injustice, right? It's
Hmm.
based on land grab, it's based on cheap labor, it's based on violence in many cases, and in heavy pollution in terms of
Hmm.
pollution and, use again of pesticides in the cotton industry and so forth and so etc. So I think that as with the fast industry, as with many industries, to be honest, one thing that consumers need to be very aware is that if we keep consuming in such a way that you consume and you throw away and you consume and you throw away, that definitely makes a toll on the whole average of impact, not just on climate, environmental crisis, right? We have many different levels of crisis. So it does come to us as well to say, I'm not going to do that kind of behavior. So the demand goes a little bit away, at least in the north, where there is the privilege to do that, or in urban settings in the south. But there is also the fact that as citizens, I think, and movements, we need to collectively organize in our neighborhoods, in our municipalities, and demand better policies for this. Because I think it should
Hmm.
be that have these products that are so bad quality that it will be thrown away after a few months of use. And that is not only about clothes, but it's also about electronic products, house
Yes, absolutely.
everything that goes broken in so easy that people need to buy another one. It is made from the design of the product that you do it as quick and as cheap as possible. You go out so that they will buy another one. So there has
Yeah.
to be stricter regulation. But in order for push for a change, it always starts with people on the streets. I mean, I
Yeah.
can say it more. It's solidarity to those on the front line, but also being active to where you are in your
Yeah.
place with your own means, with your own capacities to organize with your neighbors and from public transport to accessible public transport to
Yeah.
better regulations to avoid this massive use of this throwing consumption items to being able to subsidize other things like communal agriculture for these food gardens that are collective and that we can take care to reconnect a bit with nature. And that's not going to be sufficient for everybody to subsist on this only, but it will make a little bit of a better way of dealing with food and seasons and
Yeah. Yeah.
effort into it. So there are many levels that we could think of how to start the move, you know, towards telling the system that is not working anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I love what you said. Grassroots, I started as a grassroots activist. And I'm a lawyer now. I will always, always be a grassroots activist. I think activist lawyer is the best title anybody could ever give me. I know it has some negative connotations. I don't care
Absolutely
because
not.
because I love it. It's like grassroots. How also you looking at yourself. What are you doing? If a new phone comes out, iPhone is good at bringing phones every year. And you look at your phone is still good. Your phone still works. You don't need the new iPhone. You don't have to have the latest of everything. I think, especially in American culture, everything is so consumer focused. You want to have the best, the latest. But go back to, is it good? Is it working? Does it work for me at this moment? If you're thinking about what impacts can I have as a person, is even on in terms of like capitalism. I know now it's a trend to talk about, oh, we hate capitalism, but how can you be practical about offsetting here's the word offset, but about balancing capitalism is personal responsibility. You don't have to have the latest of everything. When you buy something new and the old one still looks good, you can give it away to somebody who would need it. You don't have to put everything in the trash. And that is a way to show where our priorities are, that we are not about, again, you spoke about the injustice, the labor, cheap labor, forced labor that's going on to produce these technologies, the clothes. And so we have to take personal responsibility for that. So my last question to you is, do you think that climate change can be solved? And what solutions would you propose? What is step one for you?
I mean, solved, it's very difficult because I think that we are already in. I mean, again, the impacts are being felt in more places, in some places more than others, and by some communities more than others. But I don't think that we can get out back. But what we can do is to prevent that it gets heavier
Mm,
or more strong or more difficult for us to, deal with it. um, I think a big chunk of what needs to happen is what we were just talking about, because it is, for me, it's more that the individual responsibility comes only when you have a collective responsibility. I think
mhm,
we need as people to talk more about this, what is happening. We are in a crucial moment in history, I would say, where decisions are being made on how the world is going to go.
mm,
The decisions that are
absolutely.
being made are really just fueling the same system that has put us in this problem.
Mm,
So we have to have these conversations more in wherever circumstances, with your neighbor, with your municipality, with the school teacher, with the nurse, with the bus driver. Everybody needs to be alert that what we need is a collective change. So wherever we are sitting down, wherever we are living, we can make changes. We can, or at least we can help to push changes. So go to the climate marches, but be aware what you are asking for, justice. Be aware that you don't want the carbon market net zero craziness, but you want real change. So, that when you talk in with your, friends, bring this topic. Let's talk about the power in this crisis. Let's talk about how this is affecting other places and how we could push for, again, something as simple as accessible public transport could make
mm,
a much of an impact in certain settings. In Europe, there is the privilege that the continent is more or less connected by trains everywhere. It's so
absolutely.
expensive. It's
Yeah,
insane. So it's cheaper to take a flight than to take a train. So how
mm,
can, and why are we not
absolutely.
it's demanding that this changes, right? So supermarkets, they have way too much, access to our food system. Why are we not talking about, we want healthier food. We want foods that are produced by, small farmers here, wherever you
In the
live,
community.
this localized
Absolutely.
economy, right?
Absolutely. I think it's so weird because I lived in Houston and the transport system is so horrible. I'm not joking. I would walk, because we lived in the suburbs. I would walk 30 minutes to the closest bus stop.
Whoa, that is a lot.
And then
Yeah.
I would take a bus. It's like I do a tour of Houston before I get to my destination. It would take me like 2 hours to get to a destination where, because I don't drive, where actually it would take me like 30 minutes to drive.
Yeah.
And I did this every day. And then coming as well, moving to Europe, you see that if I want to go to Paris now or a country, it would be like 25 pounds on Ryanair and I'm there. But if I want to say, okay, I want to take the Eurostar, I'm paying 200 pounds.
It's incredible. Yes.
So it's like, what are you then telling me? Which, by the way, I would think the opposite should be true. It should be more expensive to fly and cheaper to take the train. So it's
Exactly.
it's it's a system, and you also need to understand the drivers of the system, which is why we're saying the motor industry in the U.S. is also needs to be addressed. Like, why is it that the roads are built? The community is built where you have to drive. You have no choice but to drive. I don't want to drive.
Mm.
I don't want, even if I can learn to drive, I still don't want to drive. I want to be able to walk places and take the trains. But why is it that you are not given that choice in some places? I think the closest you can find where it's very accessible is New York, where with the subway system. Even that is outdated, and people are complaining for it to be taken care of. So it tells you, when you look around you, you can see where your government's priority lies. And
Yes,
most of the
exactly.
time, it's not with you, it's with the corporations.
Yes.
So,
The
I mean, be a part of
privatization of trains in Europe is also crazy. Here in the Netherlands is an interesting case to me because everybody
Mm,
has a, it's supposed to be this bike friendly country. And it's true, everybody has a bike and you move a lot on bikes, which is fantastic. I live in the south of Netherlands and I don't know anyone that does not have a car. We don't have a car, but everybody have a car because even though you move on bikes, the public transport system is so unreliable because it's
mm,
not well maintained, because whatever, it's being privatized. So the trains break all the time. You are always delayed. And my goodness, how many times I have been in the waiting of like a
mm,
train that is not coming or this or that. But yeah, so everybody chooses to have a car. So the priority, the public policy priority is not, oh, let's make people not actually have cars. Let's give them the option that they can
mm.
actually choose. You know, people don't
Yeah,
choose, and that is
yeah.
problematic.
No, seriously. And this is just so I was going to ask you questions like, is climate change real? What do you think? But your expertise just took this conversation on a whole different level of substance and how we can think about this issue. And I'm going to rewatch it and rewatch it and rewatch it. And that's exactly what I love about bringing experts that are not trying to be famous, that are just trying to have transparent conversations and educate us. And I'm so grateful for it to be here. And my very last question before you have to go, what is a reality check you want to give us about how we're handling discourse about climate change?
Well, I would say that is always, not only on climate change, but always very useful when we ask the question, who's benefiting from that? That
Absolutely.
in every single, because it could be also on, you know, like workers' rights or whatever policy, who's benefiting from this policy? Who is driving this? And when we really unpack it and we understand it, we can see the interest behind. Is the interest for the people? Is the interest for the climate? And the climate is not this abstract thing, but this
Mm,
climate relation to people, relation to nature, relation to land. So when we, which kind of knowledge is being put into this policy? And I think we need to have those difficult discussions, right? And to be honest, when you call me an expert, it gives me goosebumps because I don't consider myself, I mean, really, like, you know, this whole knowledge is just years of listening to people uh,
wow.
who are, you know, struggling from both sides, from the extraction and from, you know, the carbon offsets, and understanding the real dynamics and impact that these have on their lives and lands. So I just I am a learner in this as well, in listening.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I just thank you so much. And I would say climate change, as you can see, is much bigger than are we hot, are we cold? This is a very it's a very important topic for us to engage with. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. We are so lucky and so blessed to have you. Thank you for
Thank
your,
you.
I would say it again, your expertise, which is your professional, your personal, and for bringing it to the table. This is one of the most amazing conversations that I've had, and I'm glad I had it with you. So if you guys enjoyed the conversation as well, please feel free to subscribe. It really helps the channel, like and share so people can learn about this important conversation and this important topic as well. Once again, thank you all so much, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Julia.
You're welcome. Okay.